This is Patrick Russell. I'm interviewing Brian Hatheway for the first time. This interview is taking place on December the 10th, 2021, in Tucson, Arizona. This interview is being conducted by the Making History Project. How are you doing today, Brian?
I'm good. Yourself?
Very good, thank you. Could you tell me when you were born?
June of 1966.
All right, and where were you born?
Tucson.
Tucson. All right, and can you tell me a little bit about Tucson when you were growing up? What was it like?
You know, I don't really know because I left when I was 3.
All right. So where did you grow up?
6 years in Southern California, a year up in the San Francisco area, 5 years in a Boston suburb, and then a rural county in Missouri before I went to college.
Okay.
Moved quite a bit.
And what did your father do?
Geological engineer.
All right.
And then a professor at the University of Missouri.
Okay. Is he like in the oil business?
No, his he's retired, but he still dabbles as a consultant. His specialty is hazardous waste, specifically what is left after coal gasification. Much of, well, really all the gas we would use for lighting and cooking up until about 1950s was produced by baking coal, and it produces a lot of very hazardous stuff, and that's his specialty, is understanding that, especially the historical aspect.
Okay. And how about your mom? What did she do?
She was a homemaker. She's now deceased.
All right. And how big was your family growing up?
Younger brother, older sister.
Right. And
And my sister also served in the military.
okay. What branch?
She spent 3 years in the regular Army and 4 years in the Marine Corps.
And growing up, what were kind of the things that you liked to do?
Well, I actually always had a focus on going to the military. I always knew I would. I probably knew that that's what I would do since I was maybe 4 years old. And it came from, and you will probably remember these, the ubiquitous History of the United States Army and World War II series, the big green volumes. And there were a couple of them that were the pictorial histories. I think there were 2 for the European theater and 1 for the Pacific theater. And I would sit on the floor and put one of those in a dining room chair, and I would just go for hours flipping through those pages of these official U.S. Army photographs during the war. And that was it. Ever since then, I knew I was going to be a soldier.
Wow. And where did you go to high school?
1 year in the Massachusetts, or the Boston suburbs, and then 3 years in Rolla, Missouri.
All right. And did you have any hobbies or sports while in high school?
Not really. I just focused on decent grades and had a part-time job in a restaurant.
All right. And so and where did you find these Army books? It was in your local library?
No, my dad had them. He was also in the Army. He did 2 years active duty and then another 28 in the reserves.
And so you were impressed by all the interesting pictures, and did you have a vision in your mind what you wanted to do in the Army?
You know, it just would have been something in combat arms. I might have for a brief time thought I'd want to be a Marine and maybe at some point a pilot, but it was always going to be military. But it usually came back to combat arms. And And back then, I don't know what that'd have been. Probably in my mind, maybe I'd want to be a tanker or an infantryman. I'm glad I never was an infantryman, but
Right.
I ended up as an artilleryman.
All right. And when did you join the military?
Well, after high school, I went to the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. Graduated with a commission as a second lieutenant of field artillery in 1988. In May of '88, and then October of '88 went on active duty.
All right. And how was that experience at VMI?
It was terrific. Some of the closest friends I will ever have. In fact, really my closest friends in some form or another basically carried a gun. They either come from my time at VMI or my time in the Army or my time as a special agent in diplomatic security. VMI was a terrific place. It was, I would do it again, but I would tremble because going through the rat line in 1984 was certainly a very different experience than what it would be today. Nobody would ever lay hands on you and hit you, but it was a productive level of hazing that was, in most cases, really applied across the board, and it served a very good purpose. It really brought a class together. And while at VMI, and I'd say life at VMI, especially back then, was about as close as you could get in the 1980s to what life might have been like living in a barracks in the Army a century earlier. And while I was there, I got to go to airborne school as a cadet, so I got my jump wings in '86.
Oh, nice. And how was that training? Airborne training?
It was kind of neat. I'm a 5-jump chump. I did those 5, put the wings on my uniform, and never did it again. I'm not a big fan of heights, so it was a challenge for me to go out the door,
Okay.
but it was also quite a thrill.
And besides the, how would we call it, the character building of VMI, what else do you remember fondly?
Oh, just tremendous friendships, and just it was an all-encompassing life, and a good education. Came out with a bachelor's degree of civil engineering.
And then you went into, right after the graduation, you went into active duty?
No, I had about a 4-month gap. The Army brings in lieutenants based on available positions, and so they brought me in on the 11th of October. So they had already filled all the positions for fiscal year '88. So even though I entered active duty in October of 1988, it was considered year group 89 or fiscal year '89. So that summer before going on active duty, I spent it living and working with my roommate's family as what they call a rod and chain guy on land surveying crews in Manhattan and Queens and a little bit of the Bronx. And pretty much every borough, I guess. Yeah, I was in every borough except Staten Island. That was quite an experience in the '80s.
Big city life after VMI.
Yeah. and that roommate of mine later himself, he did several years on active duty, and then not long ago retired from the National Guard as a tanker.
So when you did enter, you went into the Army.
Yep.
All right. And what was your line of duty in the Army?
I was branch field artillery, so my first place was the 5 or 6 months of the field artillery officer basic course, which back then was divided into, even though we would refer to it as just FAOBC, it was divided into 2 pieces because depending upon where you went in field artillery, you had slightly different training. Most of us were going to go to cannon units, howitzer units. So you did a a chunk of the initial chunk of it, which everybody did, which was just basic field artillery and being an Army officer. And then from there, you went to the cannon battery officer course, or I guess if you were going to go to back then, if you were going to go to a Pershing unit or an MLRS unit, you'd get a different set of training. But for those of us going to howitzer units, and that's by far the majority, you went into the cannon battery officer course as part of OBC, and it had a very heavy emphasis on gunnery, which is very technical, and quite a bit of time learning to do calls for fire and adjusting field artillery.
Now, did you choose artillery, or did artillery choose you?
Well, when you commission in VMI, it's considered one of the senior military colleges, so it's a guarantee of going on active duty, but it's still an ROTC program for the actual commissioning piece. And so you put in a dream list of branches, and then once you receive your branch assignment and you rank order them 1 through 10, then you put in your dream list for where you want to be assigned. And my number one choice was armor. Field artillery was my second choice, and then I'd probably put infantry or probably engineers followed by infantry. I knew I wanted to be a combat arms guy. I got field artillery. The majority of those commissioned into active duty from VMI my year ended up going. Most of us went field artillery, or at least more field artillery than the other branch. Very few got armor. Field artillery then towards the tail end of the Cold War was huge. Artillery really, really made up an important part of the Army's combat capability, especially in Korea and Europe. And then I am very thankful I got field artillery in hindsight once I just saw what life was like in the field. And we were in the field as much as anyone else. It was just I don't know, I'm just glad I was never an infantryman. And then when given choices for assignments, like I would say a dumbass, I had probably put all light fighting units first. I want to go to the 82nd, and then the 101st, and Vicenza. And I got Germany, as did the majority of us. And I got Germany with a heavy unit, a mechanized unit. And again, I am so thankful in hindsight that I went to Germany and I went to a heavy unit. It fits my personality. There is a mindset that goes with light fighters, and I don't have that mindset.
So what is, tell me a little bit more about that. Like, why were you interested in artillery, and how does that match your personality?
Well, as a civil engineer, artillery gunnery came to me very easily. Field artillery is well, I like to use the phrase, when you're dealing with cannon artillery, it is elegantly, violently applied physics. It is very, very predictable. When you put a howitzer at a particular deflection, meaning horizontal angle, and a particular quadrant elevation, meaning vertical angle, and you have a projectile of a given weight and shape with a propellant charge of a given size behind it, it's very predictable where it's going to land, other than minor variables, and a lot of gunnery is learning how to nail down those variables, everything from rotation of the earth to weather conditions to the temperature on the ground. But when it comes down to it, those variations are relatively small, and it's all about putting rounds on target accurately on time. It's pretty neat, and when done right, it's devastating. As you as a student of history know, World War I is an example. Where did the majority of the casualties come from? It was field artillery.
Okay.
And on top of that, we were still very much frontline guys, especially me, because I spent most of my time in Germany. I was a fire support officer, so I was a frontline forward observer team chief with armor units.
And are you a fan of history?
Absolutely. I would rather have been I would rather have studied history than civil engineering, but I also thought one day I'd need to make a living.
And what about World War II history?
Oh, World War II, World War One history, tremendously interesting for me.
Right. And so, being a artilleryman, you must have some appreciation for the Soviet call to arms, so to speak, at the end of World War II, where they came and brought a lot of artillery to bear. That seemed to be their main strategy.
Oh, and it's very effective, and we very much did the same thing, and we continued to do that in subsequent conflicts because artillery gives you the opportunity to reach out and touch someone in a way that at least you have a chance of protecting the guys on the front line somewhat. And the more precise you are with it, the better you are with it, the more likely you're going to save lives on your side.
So you went into active duty. You did a lot of training in the beginning. Did you have to go through basic training at all?
No, it's done differently on the officer side.
All right. And then, what was the equipment that you worked on? What was the piece?
On active duty, once I got to a unit, because in training it's whatever they have in the schoolhouse, and you don't spend a lot of time on the guns themselves. Once I got to Germany, I was assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Field Artillery, colloquially the Gunners, and we were, although part of Davardi Division Artillery, we were, and the idea with artillery is never in reserve, it's never dedicated to a particular, say, brigade. But at the same time, the way the Army was organized in Germany with these kasernas or kasernes, these individual bases, I was on a brigade level base in a place called Kirchgens, which is just outside the town of Butzbach, about 45 minutes north of Frankfurt. And so we were nominally the direct support artillery battalion for 1st Brigade of the 3rd Armored Division, the Ready First Combat Team, which exists today in that exact name, except it's in the 1st Armored Division, because in 1992, after Desert Storm, the peace dividend from the end of the Cold War, a number of divisions were shut down, and the 8th Infantry Division and the 3rd Armored Division combined, with portions of them inactivating or deactivating, leaving 3 complete brigades, which was reflagged as the 1st Armored Division. And then over and that was in 7th Corps or 5th Corps, and then down in 7th Corps in southern Germany, the 1st Armored Division and the 3rd Infantry Division did something similar and just became the 3rd Infantry Division. It's just a big reflagging. So my battalion still exists today at Fort Bliss. Okay. As part of the 1st Armored Division. So and our main piece of equipment was the M109 Alpha 2/Alpha 3 howitzer. They're the same. And Alpha 2 is, as I recall, is manufactured as an Alpha 2, and Alpha 3 was just an Alpha 1 that had been in depot had been converted to an Alpha 2. So same howitzer. 109 is a 155 millimeter self-propelled howitzer.
So it is self-propelled?
Yes. I was in a heavy division.
Okay. All right. And and what did you do as an officer? What was your line of responsibility?
So I had 39 months in Germany, a little over 3 years. And 2 of those years I spent in fire support, and I was a company fire support officer, which is the team leader for a team of forward observers. I spent my time as a team leader or team chief. They call them FSOs, fire support officers, also known as FISTers, FIST being fire support team. And I supported 2 different tank companies. In Germany, in training, it was Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 32nd Armor of the 1st Brigade, 3rd Armor Division. And then in Desert Storm, that unit was left behind, and the 3rd Armor Division took with it instead a tank battalion from the 8th Infantry Division, 4th Battalion, 34th Armor. So during Desert Storm, I was a fire support officer for Delta Company, 4th Battalion, 34th Armor. Many say that most likely the reason for that is that the division commander and the brigade commander did not have as much confidence in the combat readiness of 2nd Battalion, 32nd Armor. And so they went for what they considered a more combat ready battalion. And I think that was probably based on battalion commanders. 232 Armor had a weak battalion commander. 434 Armor had a tremendously strong battalion commander.
And what are some of your day-to-day operations? What are you doing? Describe what you do.
Well, peacetime, we spent a great deal of time in the motor pool because we're on tracked vehicles. I was on an M9081 Fist V made by Emerson Electric. Really not a good vehicle. To put it bluntly, it was pardon the expression, it was a piece of shit. It was not effective. It was an M113 Alpha 3 variant that looked just like the M901 improved tow vehicle. It had this hammerhead arrangement on it. The vehicle could not keep up with tanks. With the M1A1s that we supported or the Bradleys, it had a laser locator designator built into that hammerhead turret arrangement, but you had to stop to use it, and you could take 10 to 15 minutes for the gyroscope that would work out direction for it to calibrate and be ready for use. And that's pointless when you're in a unit that has mobile warfare as its big means of fighting. So it was an ineffective vehicle, and many of us believed that the vehicle was, the Army bought the vehicle because Emerson Electric in the 80s was a major U.S. company and it was going bankrupt. But it was a really poor companion to Bradleys and M1s. So we spent a lot of time in the motor pool dealing with it. And then we spent a lot of time in the field. When you take the Grafenwehr, the Hohenfels, the Wildflecken, these are all training areas in Germany. These training rotations, plus the 6 months we spent in the Gulf, I added it up. I spent 1 out of every 3 days of my over 3-year tour in some form or another in the field.
And what are you doing in the field?
When you're a fire support officer, you spend a lot of time up on the observation points. We call it OP7 in Grafenwehr, which is a very high hill that overlooks the impact area. And we go up there for days on end, and we would do calls for fire for the various firing batteries in our battalion, Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie battery. And we were 3x8 battalion, meaning there were 3 batteries of 8 howitzers each. And when you go 3x8, they break the howitzers into 2 4-gun platoons. So that gives you 2, 4, 6 firing units, total of 6 platoons in the battalion, versus the earlier Army called 3x6, where you had 6 guns per battery, and they were just together as a single unit of 6. So you only had 3 firing units in the old system. So we had 6 firing units. We were always busy up there. And then later, after Desert Storm, when I went to a firing battery as a fire direction officer and as a cannon platoon leader, again, a lot of time on maintenance, a lot of time on additional duties, and then a lot of time in the field, going out and doing shoots.
And are you doing a lot of live fire shoots in Germany back in the day?
Yeah, probably about once a quarter you'd go somewhere to shoot. We might do now. Twice a year, you would go to Grafenwehr for a major 30-day rotation, where you would really run through your paces and do quite a bit of shooting. And Grafenwehr was a good place for that. It was the largest training area in Germany, and you could really shoot as a unit. Occasionally, and usually with each one of those big graph rotations, we would then do a 2-week rotation through Hohenfels, the maneuver training center in Europe, similar to, on a smaller scale to the NTC in California or the JRTC. It was the maneuver training center in Germany, and there, without live fire, we would go into maneuvers as a maneuver brigade with supporting fires from, well, with supporting artillery units, and then as a forward observer, I would be with that tank company when it's doing its thing in there in Hohenfels. And then occasionally we'd go shoot in these small training areas like Bildfleck and closer to the border, but very small training areas, so you can only fire high angle fire.
And is there a time where you would have your armor engage also basically as artillery? Do they ever do that? No. That is in theory possible, and it's something that tankers trained on in what many of them will refer to as the dinosaur days and 60s and before, where you actually, for any kind of gun, whether it's a tank gun or an artillery howitzer, they have what they call tabular firing tables, TFTs, and they're these thick books that are just one table after another about what a given round will do with a given powder charge at a given angle. It's the physics data. It's statistical data developed over years and years and years, probably out of White Sands. And so you could, in theory, line up a tank platoon of 4 tanks, pull out a tabular firing table, set those guns at a certain angle, and yeah, you could drop rounds in a place. But that was prior to the M1. The type of rounds the M1 would use just didn't lend themselves to that, and it's very low angle fire. And so what you get is you get a really large probability of error in range, meaning when you miss, you either really go way over or you land really short, but you can be very accurately on line. Now, a howitzer firing at high angle or a mortar has a very low probability of error in range, but a very large probability of error in deflection because the round is in the air for so long. So tanks just don't lend themselves to that sort of thing. It would have been almost a last ditch thing you might do in World War II, Korea, maybe Vietnam, but I don't even see it there because it's just huge errors in range. It's like as a federal agent when I was in Iraq in 04, 05, and these militiamen and insurgents down in southern Iraq where I was would fire rockets at us. They would just slap them on a berm, hook a 9-volt battery up to them, and just not even on a rail sometimes, and fire them at us. And they either hit us or they just massively missed. Sorry about that. Had an incoming call. So, no, you wouldn't use a tank that way. Just simply wouldn't. It's a direct fire weapon. Got it. And so the contingency, I mean, were there war games, I would assume, in Germany where you'd have to practice, for the potential invasion of Europe?
The balloon going up?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's what we did at Hohenfels. That was the maneuver training center. We did that there. Plus, when I first got to Germany, I got to Germany in March of 1989. And so the Cold War, we had no idea that the wall was going to fall later that summer, or a year later, I'm sorry. No, that summer. We had no idea that was going to happen. And so we were going on terrain walks in the border zones, very close to it. We were going to the battle positions we would take if the balloon went up. If we got the alert, in fact, in my case, the battalion I was supporting, 2nd Battalion, 32nd Armor, they were in and around Bad Hirschfeld. And so we had these large battle books of laminated pieces of maps with battle positions that we would occupy should that happen. They were all classified secret, and they were all kept in a safe when we weren't in the field, and we worked on those. And then in the summer of '89, I think we were between a Grafenwehr and a Hohenfels rotation. The wall came down and everything changed. In fact,
And
I got to go to I got to go to Berlin on flag orders in June, a month before, or no, 4 or 5 months before the wall came down. To just as a tourist, had to do that in uniform, and it was a very unique experience. Checkpoint Alpha, Checkpoint Bravo, Checkpoint Charlie, flag orders, how you would interact with the Soviet border guards, how you would have to ignore the East German border guards. Really interesting piece of history. And in the East, you'd still see at that time some of the buildings closer to the wall had never been restored, so they were without windows. They still had chunks taken out of them and bullet pock marks. Really interesting.
and what did it feel like? So this is before the wall came down, and this could be potentially the hot spot of your next engagement, right? How did it feel like walking through the streets of Berlin and all those different things, seeing all that?
Well, that was historically neat. I had not long before I had read Cornelius Ryan's Last Battle, but where it really struck you was when you thought about it. Not so much Berlin, because that's not where we would serve in war. We were going to be in the, what would have been 3rd Squadron, 11th Cavalry would have been the covering force for our unit. So we were in their area, which is Bad Hirschfeld, a little bit north of sort of the as I recall, the Fulda area. So it's all considered the Fulda Gap, but that's a big geologic feature. We always had the sense that it probably wouldn't go well for us. If you ever read Harold Coyle's Team Yankee, which I read when I was at Hohenfels once as an observer controller for the 11th Cavalry, 11th Armored Cavalry, the Pfister, the fire support guy, actually died in like the first 20 minutes of the battle. And we thought that's probably what's going to happen to us. We were all very, very thankful when the wall came down, because that would have been an ugly fight.
And what would be the fear that you would be targeted, that your pieces, your artillery pieces, are prime weapons of interest that need to be eliminated, so you're a target?
Oh. No, I was a fire support officer at the time, so I would have been in that Emerson Electric M9081 Fist V, and I've got 4 radios in there, and every time you key a mic, when you're dealing with, if you were fighting with the Soviets, you key a mic, you might die. And here I am. I'm a vehicle that has 4 antennas sticking out of my vehicle. I'd probably be one of the first guys I'd want to kill.
And it would presumably be what, an airplane that would be doing it?
Oh, it could be artillery. If for instance you're picked up from radio transmissions, it's simple triangulation. If you have a couple of stations that pick up those radio transmissions, you just got to draw a couple of lines, and the more lines you draw, the more accurate the location is, and then just drop a whole pile of artillery on that spot.
But you're doing the same thing though on the other end too, right?
Absolutely. And you fire a howitzer, or let's say if an artillery unit on the other side fires at you, and within the division you have what's called counter battery radar, 2 different types, and the only difference between the two is one's larger, one's smaller, one focuses on higher angle, one focuses on lower angle fires. But these were radar that would pick up an artillery round in the air, but because artillery has a very predictable ballistic solution, if you can have a radar lock onto it, take that data and drop it down to a computer, you can almost immediately determine not only where that round is going to land, but you can figure out where it came from. Then you take that location and you shoot it to an artillery battalion, and then you just dump a whole pile of artillery right on that spot. You can't stop what they've already put in the air, but what you're trying to do is stop them from putting more in the air.
And how fast is that process of doing the calculations from the radar, feeding it back to a computer, getting the orders out to the counter battery, and then launching? What's that time?
Oh, it's measured in just a couple of minutes back then. Nowadays, there are far more sophisticated solutions that are very, very fast. And I've only seen that on the periphery because that came around after I left the regular Army, or after I left active duty, because I've been on active duty 2 different periods. But I did get to see a little bit of that. For instance, my last assignment in my civilian job before I retired was in Sinai with the Multinational Force of Observers. And in one of the MFO bases in the Sinai, they have one of these counter battery setups. Those are super fast. And you can tie them in with weapon systems that can very rapidly, probably even fully automated. But it was different back in the 80s. But still pretty fast and could be pretty effective. But on the flip side, when you're turning on a radar and you're sending out these radar beams, that in turn is electromagnetic radiation, like keying a radio. So you got to be careful about leaving them on, or you're going to then have something come down on you, whether it's aircraft or artillery. When you have a sophisticated foe who is well armed, you have to be very, very careful. And I would say that maybe we've been able to get a little bit sloppy these last 20 years dealing with insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan where they can't do that sort of thing. But we would definitely have to keep our game tight against somebody like a Russian or a Chinese military unit, because they'll have every bit of that capability.
And were you involved in any way with training with any of the other allied NATO nations, so Germany, England, France?
No, not really. We would encounter them. We used to run into Canadians and Germans on the observation points in Grafenwehr, but no, we never directly trained with them. That happened at other levels. I had quite a bit of interface with other armies as a civilian with the State Department in Iraq, where the local supporting military unit for me was a British Army unit, several as they rotated through, but not when I was in Germany as a young officer.
And so there are obviously defensive plans in place, or there were. Well, there probably are now again in Germany. And then are there contingencies for going on the offense once the defense does what it needs to do?
Oh, of course. That's what Army staff officers do. That's what divisional staff officers do. There's always a plan for about any reasonable contingency you can come up with, whether that's at the national level all the way down to battalion level. It's what the Army does. It plans.
And so how long were you in Germany?
I got there in March of 1989, and I left in June of 1992. And I spent 179 days of that time. Exactly, it was just coincidental it came out to that. 179 days in Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm in Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait.
All right, and so before we continue on that, give me 1 second. So in the context of being in Germany, then you, for lack of a better word, took a break and you ended up going to the Middle East?
Yep. We, after the wall came down, that really changed our mission, because we were no longer focused on a Soviet threat. The Soviet army was still there, but it just collapsed. Everything just collapsed for the good. And at that point, then in August of 1990, when Saddam Hussein did his thing, that made it pretty clear that we would probably be free. And at that time in Germany, we had 5th Corps and 7th Corps. 5th Corps was just from a little bit south of Frankfurt North, 7th Corps from that point south. And each of those contained 2 full heavy divisions plus a forward brigade of a stateside division. So we had the equivalent of almost 5 combat arms divisions or heavy mechanized divisions in Germany just for the U.S. Army, plus all the associated corps artillery, Corps maintenance. It must have been 250,000 troops in Germany at that time, and that focus was no longer on the Soviet Union. And I remember we were at Wildflecken and just ending a battery shoot. I was briefly the fire direction officer for Bravo Battery, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Field Artillery. We had just done an officer rotation, and we were rail loading the howitzers to take them back to Kirchgoings to Ayers Kaserne is where we were, named after a 4th Infantry Division soldier who posthumously was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, and used to be a Luftwaffe recovery field, but that was our brigade base. So we were rail loading to go back there. It was snowing, and my battery commander, a guy named Jim Drago, who later retired as a full colonel, he was reading the Stars and Stripes, and on it said 2 armored divisions from Germany were going to be deployed as part of Operation Desert Shield. The divisions hadn't been named, but there were 2 armored divisions in Germany and 2 mechanized infantry divisions, which are interchangeable and more or less the same. But we pretty much knew at that point we were going to get deployment orders. And sure enough, within just 3-4 days, we were told, yes, we were deploying as a division. Our battalion commander reversed all the officer rotations he had just done because he wanted everybody in the most experienced positions. So a week after getting to a firing battery, I was right back in fire support. And then as a division, we were going to go over in January of 1991. I volunteered to go on brigade advance party, so I went on the 19th of December, a week before Christmas, flew into King Fahd Air Base, which is just outside of Dammam, and then spent a couple of days in Cement City, and then we went out to what was going to be our assembly area in the desert as we were getting ready. So we went out there, we surveyed things. It was just a handful of us for each battalion. And then we came back into the port of Dammam, and about that time, the division was coming in, flying, with the equipment coming in by ship back in Germany, while we were forward on the advance party. The battalion was, or the whole brigade, the whole division was rail loading all the tracks, sending them to Antwerp. They would be put on roll-off ships, and then they timed it so that we ended up, all of us as a consolidated brigade and division, in the port of Dammam for, 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks, waiting for the ships to arrive, and then a great deal of time spent getting the vehicles ready once they were offloaded from the ship. In some cases, painting them, but that didn't happen in all cases. So you had a mix. Some vehicles were desert painted, some were not. None of us had desert uniforms at that time, but that didn't matter. You're riding inside a track. Save that for the light fighters. And then they were loaded on HETs, these heavy equipment trailers, these large trucks that transport these tanks, and we ran the Tap Line Road out to our assembly area, and we were on that road when it all started. But back in the port, we were all housed in these large German fest tents, just a sea of cots. And that's about the time the rains fall too. In Saudi Arabia, winter you get monsoons, and at one point we had almost a foot of standing water in our tents. Destroyed a lot of guys' stuff: paperback books, Sony Walkman, personal letters and photos. These duffel bags were swamped. It was pretty bad for some of the guys. But we made, once the vehicles were all loaded, we shipped them out to an area out around King Khalid military city, a couple hours outside of Riyadh, in the middle of nowhere. And we began some pretty significant train ups, but back on the Tap Line Road. So we were on the Tap Line Road making this movement when the air war started. And I remember we were at a roadside fuel and food resupply point where they would just refuel the trucks. Everybody gets chow, because it must have been a 12-hour drive. We were in city buses along with the wheeled vehicles, and then these large truck trailer arrangements to carry the tracks, because that's far too far to be driving tracks. And they put us in ditches. It was interesting. They were D7 dozer-sized ditches as air raid ditches right there along the highway. And we were in those ditches when, and they put us in there knowing the air war was about to start. And sure enough, I remember because I was with a tank company at that point, one of the tank commanders, staff sergeant, had a little AM radio, or shortwave radio, had a little earpiece in, and he was repeating the news broadcast he was hearing to us. And that's when we looked up, and it was a beautiful dark night sky, but you could actually see the running lights of quite a few aircraft as they were coming over us. And this just must have been from every airfield in Saudi Arabia, and just quite a few aircraft. And then the running lights would cut off as they crossed the border, because at that point we were probably 25, 30 miles south of the Iraqi border, just along what they call the Tap Line Road. It's just the road that comes from the eastern shore of Saudi Arabia and goes inland, but on the northern end. And the lights cut out, and we're still sitting in this ditch. It's cold, and I don't know, an hour and a half, 2 hours later, you could hear the engines, and here comes these aircraft again, but you couldn't see them until they picked a point just about crossing the border again. And then all the lights came back on, and you saw them returning to base. It was just interesting time. It sort of brought home that this was real. And then shortly after that, we piled back in the vehicles and continued our drive out to the assembly area. And for 2 months, almost 2 months, about 6 weeks, we did significant train-ups. We would maneuver as platoons, and then from platoons, we would maneuver as companies, and then from companies, we would maneuver as battalions, and then as brigade, and just these wide open spaces in the desert, learning how to turn these large armored units, and practicing especially breaching obstacles, breaching minefields, and how you go about that. Really some of the best training I ever had in the military. Really something, because we took it very seriously at that point.
And any observations in terms of cultural differences when you went over there? I mean, it's a very different environment. You went from cold Germany to a desert, right?
Well, now, most soldiers did not get to see any of that cultural difference. Because I was on the advanced party, I was one of a couple of guys we were issued $20,000 in cash, and it's binary. You have one person can hold the cash and one can spend it, but you can never do both as one person. So I had $20,000 in cash in my cargo pockets of my uniform, and then I'm working with another lieutenant who has the authority to spend it. And we had a list of things we were supposed to buy, and we were running around Dammam, Saudi Arabia, and Dhahran, and we were buying generators, flashlights, barber clippers. We were buying anything that we thought the unit needed that we didn't have as part of the TO&E, the basic equipment assigned to a unit, or that we were short of. So I got to spend time in Dhahran and Dammam, going out to Kentucky Fried Chicken in Saudi Arabia for my first time. I got to see how things were separated. It was really interesting going through these shopping malls, and for me that was of course a first. Most soldiers never got to see any of that. They just went right out into the field. But I got to see that. And then later in the State Department, I spent several years in the Middle East, so it all became very, very familiar. In fact, I returned to Kuwait for 2.5 years, 25 years after the fact. But yeah, it was something. But realized most soldiers never got to see that.
And given that experience, what were some of your observations?
I didn't think about it a lot at the time. It was unique. It was different. It was a first for me. I'd never been to the Middle East. Again, that all really didn't come home until I actually went there to live when I was in the Foreign Service, where I actually that was part of my life. I lived in a Kuwaiti neighborhood. I shopped in Kuwait. My kids went to school in an international school in Kuwait. But when I was in the Army, I was 24 years old. Yeah, our focus was on the fight that we knew was coming.
All right, so now you're doing a lot of training, and you're there for the beginning of the air war. And then what happens? What do you end up doing?
So we continued that train up all the way up until, it must have been 2 or 3 days before the 24th of February, when at that point the training stopped and we moved forward as a brigade and as a division, just west of the point where Kuwait, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia all come together. So our point of crossing into Iraq was going to be in Iraq. We weren't going to Kuwait. We were part of the big 7th Corps. Yeah, because even though I was in 5th Corps in Germany, when we were in deployed, it was 7th Corps as the overall headquarters. And so we moved forward to a point that was probably, I don't know, about 20 miles from the Iraqi border. And we just stopped in place as units so that when the time came, we would be able to just roll forward, more or less arranged as we needed to be. And we were at that point within artillery range of the Iraqi army. So no radio transmissions, very, very low key. We were doing our best to not have them know we were there. Now, I had my first scud alert when that happened. Even though the guys back in the port were getting hit by them, we were sitting there waiting to cross when one of those scud alerts came, and that was a bit of a scare, because the ballistic path of a missile, like an artillery round, is very predictable, and it was predicted that it was going to pass very close to where we were. And at that point, they didn't know, well, are they going to send it to us or are they going to keep going? So we alerted right there. We ripped open brand new mop suits, the chemical suits. We were putting on our masks as fast as we'd ever done, faster than ever we did in training, buttoning down the vehicles. It was it felt very, very real, because it could have happened. In turn, it just kept going over us. We never even saw it in the air. It's a very high altitude. A Scud's a very high altitude missile, and it went on to strike the port areas. So we sat there until the 24th of February. Some engineer unit had already gone forward and cut through the berm, and it was a pretty high berm on the border. God, it must have been 15, 20 feet high. And we had lanes, numbered lanes cut through. Engineer units had cut those lanes through the berms. They had already cleared any possible, they cleared the path in case there were mines. We were assigned lanes. We crossed into Iraq, and we began the most exhausting 4 days of my life. In some really interesting weather on a very large movement to contact. Pardon the cat right below me. We continued that day and into the next night. The next evening, we had some of the worst rainfall I've ever been through. Lightning striking, thunder, torrential downpours, and we stopped in the middle of that. And you try to dig in when you're stopped, because you don't know if you're going to get hit. And I remember I forget the name of the vehicle, but it's the tracked dozer that the Army engineers were using back then. They probably still are today. And they were digging in the vehicles. And I remember that they were bulldozing, hull down trenches to put the tanks and the other tracked vehicles in, and we were pulling into those in case we had to defend while we were stopped. I don't remember why we even stopped that night. And then about the time we got that finished, the poor bastard who was the engineer who was running that, I think he was out of 23rd Engineers. He could have been 12th Engineers. They were both supporting us. He was exhausted because he had driven all day, and then he spent all night doing that. And then as soon as he finished, we just turned around and just kept going and pulled out of those positions. And that went on. It must have been I don't know, it's maybe a day and a half before we came into contact. And then it's just a sort of a blur of events. As the fire support officer, I was right in the middle of my tank company, which was task organized. So we had 2 tank platoons and 1 Bradley infantry platoon, because, pardon me, somebody else had tried to call me. So a brigade, within a brigade, you task organize. So our brigade had 2 tank battalions and 2 Bradley infantry battalions. Now within that, you'll associate a tank battalion with a Bradley battalion, and they each trade a company. So the Bradley battalion will give up one of its Bradley companies to the tank battalion will give up a tank company to the Bradley battalion, so that and then you in turn further break that tank company down over at the Bradley battalion, or the Bradley company and the tank battalion down to individual platoons, and you send them to tank companies, so that you have a capability. If you have 2 tank platoons and a Bradley platoon, infantry works well with tanks, tanks work well with infantry. Infantry's vulnerable without tanks, but tanks are vulnerable without infantry. So we were task organized. And I'm right in the middle of this tank company, or task force at that point, or team, like, actually, they're called teams, of 2 tank platoons and a tank and a Bradley company. And we're on this movement to contact in what's called echelon right. So it's like a V, but short on one side, long on the other. A platoon, a platoon, a platoon, and then the company commander, the company XO and their tanks, the fire support officer, me and my vehicle, my tracked vehicle. We had a forward air controller team from the Air Force with us in an M113. And we're just moving forward as part of our battalion, as part of our brigade, as part of our division. And eventually we encountered the Iraqi army. They didn't know what hit them, because we had spent that 30 days of air war. They started deep, and then as we got closer to the time where we crossed that berm, the Army helicopters and the Air Force attack aircraft had started pounding things closer and closer to the front line, and they just eviscerated the Iraqi army's ability to communicate down to the battalion level. So we were hitting units who probably had no idea we were there, and they in turn were having a hard time communicating to any unit next to them. So we were just munching them, just piece by piece by piece, because they could have been very deadly for us, but we eliminated their ability to communicate. Plus, at that point, they were probably exhausted from being hit around the clock, and we just rolled through them. We really rolled through them. Very little return fire. We did take some, but it was an exhausting 4 days. I went 3 straight days without any sleep at all. I was falling asleep standing up in the hatch of my vehicle. It was exhausting.
And are you doing your forward observing? Is that your main thing?
Well, now, yeah, we're there to, 1, call fires if necessary, and 2, to track, because we don't just call fires, but we're the element in that tank company who has access to multiple radio frequencies, radio nets. So I'm listening to the brigade command net. I'm listening to the battalion command net for the tank, for the brigade and the tank battalion, and I'm able to listen to the artillery battalion net. And then I have a 4th radio on the company net for within my tank company. So I'm listening to 4 radio nets at one time. So I've got we had just 2 weeks before received our first GPSs. So I was one of 2 GPSs in the tank company. So in theory, I'm able to somewhat track what's going on, except it's not like I'm getting grid reports of where other units are, because we were moving constantly. So we're controlling fires, but we're also just tracking what's going on. But in this case, our brigade commander, who later went on to become a major general, was Bill Nash, just a huge war fighter, tremendous guy. He controlled all the artillery fires, and he saved lives by doing that. So in fact, I didn't call any fire. I was almost like being a spectator, and I just watched as my tank, especially the tanks in the company, just pound the Iraqi vehicles, because they had optics I just didn't have. They could hit something out 3 kilometers away on the move. and I would just see a tank turret rotate. I'd see it fire, and if they hit an Iraqi vehicle with a heat round, I would see a bloom of flame, and if they hit it with a sabot round, I'd see a shower of sparks, and we just hit everything as we move forward. On the night of the 26th, we had a very unfortunate incident in our divisional cavalry squadron, 4th Battalion, or 4th Squadron, 7th Cavalry, 47 Cav. One of their troops, they were screening on our right flank, drifted in front of us. They didn't know it, and we didn't know it, and they had Iraqis in front of them, and they were being fired on, and we knew they were being fired on, but we didn't know they were there. We thought, and this is what we think happened, is my battalion fired on and probably hit 2 Bradleys and killed 2 soldiers, and it's a very difficult thing to think about, but yeah. Yeah, it was not one of the bright points of that, and I think I was right next to one of the tanks that fired. But so we continued on and just kept moving for 4 days. Other things that come to mind is I remember coming up to an Iraqi trench line, and we came up, our vehicles went from echelon right to coming up on line. So we had the 8 platoon tanks plus the XO and the company commander, so 10 M1s plus the 4 Bradleys just on line, and I'm right behind them by 20, 30 meters maybe, and we're pulling up to a trench line a couple of hundred meters, maybe several hundred meters to our front, and you can just see it as sort of a scar in the ground. I mean, they had just pushed soil up or sand up, and they started firing at us, and it was just flashes. And surreal as that moment was, I'm standing in the hatch of my vehicle, and the first thing that popped in my mind is they're taking pictures of us because it looked like flash cubes. I mean, they were firing at us, but that was the first thing that came to mind. Strange what you think about when this happens. And then no main guns, it was just the 50 caliber machine guns and the coax guns, and then the 25 millimeters on the Bradleys and the coax on the Bradleys, coaxial machine guns, 7.62 M240s. They just tore that trench line up and down, just ripped the shit out of it. And the firing stopped. And then I remember off to the left side, my vision would have been the right side in the trench. A number of the Iraqis started coming out of the trench with their hands up, and they were, they must have been 400 or 500 meters, but I think they were closer because I swear I could make out facial hair. But I didn't call the mission, but probably the brigade commander had, because we were taking fire, had called an artillery mission. So my battalion, my artillery battalion, started firing DPICM, dual purpose improved conventional munitions, the bomblets, the round, I don't know, a couple of hundred meters in the air, the case blows open and it drops these little D-cell sized bomblets all over the place. And so I have these Iraqis coming towards us, and then the ground just erupts. And it's not like the flump, flump, flump of individual detonations that you get with the idea of classic artillery like you'd see in the movies. These bomblets, there's thousands of them falling. And my thinking is, if you were to have a room with about 6 inches of confectioner's powdered sugar on the floor and nothing else, and you just took 10,000 BBs and threw them into it, you could just imagine the dust that comes up. And that's what happened. The entire ground just lifted in dust. You didn't see any individual detonations. It was just a sparkle in the air as these artillery rounds were busting open, and then the ground just lifted. And these Iraqis who were surrendering as they came towards us, they just vanished. It was very sad because I knew at the time, I think I cried, because they were done. They just wanted to surrender, but there's nothing we could do because those rounds were probably in the air as those guys started walking out. Once a round leaves the tube, there's no going back. And they just vanished. And then we rode right past that point as we crossed that trench. Just moments later, there was nothing, not even a body part. They just just vaporized. They were gone. All you saw out there were the armored vehicles, the wrecked vehicles, but those guys were gone. And then there were other instances where we had, thankfully, when guys surrendered to us over those couple of days, there were no issues like that, and we just gave them MREs. If we stopped, we tried to feed them. These guys they were harmless at this point. They were just bedraggled, beat, tired, just relieved that they were able to surrender and that they were going to survive. And we would just send them to the rear. In some cases, we just sent them to the rear unescorted, and we just kept going because there was no harm having them behind us at that point. These guys, they were done. And we just kept moving forward. And the thing about this is you hear the expression, the fog of war. When you're in a situation like that, your world is what you can see, what you can hear, and that's it. Now, you might hear something on the radio net saying that there's, an adjoining unit, something about that unit, but you can't see them. My world is what I can see and what I can hear, I can see with my own eyes. So you become very isolated. And so there is a big picture, but you don't see it. And the fog is almost literal in this case too. It's not just sort of an information fog. It was, the weather was bad. It was cold. It was windy. It was hazy. It had been raining. So our visibility was very low, a couple 100 meters, except for the tanks with their thermal sights, you could see through it, but we couldn't in the forward observer vehicles. So it's just gray, windy. And at the same time, like MLRS units, there's an MLRS battery that occasionally moves and actually gets in front of us. And then we pass them, and then they pass us. And then at one point, when we're forward of them, they start firing. And I remember those rockets were so loud that even with my crewman's helmet with 4 radio nets and my Detroit diesel engine with a bad muffler, I could still hear those rockets pass over me. And you'd look up, and they're just fairly low altitude. These MLRS rockets are just screaming over us in trails of flame, hitting the units in front of us. And then to this day, I'm very attached to A-10s. Pardon me. A lot of memories. But the A-10s flew close air for us, not Apaches. Even though our division had Apaches and our divisional cavalry had Cobras, it was the A-10s that flew close air support for my battalion, my brigade. And boy, that was a sight. The A-10s would come screaming in at very low level, and they're not fast, and they make a high-pitched whine as they go over. And these guys were coming over us, and then they would just disappear in the ground haze a kilometer or two ahead of us. You just wouldn't see them anymore. It's like they just disappeared into the ground because of the cloud and the haze and the smoke and the debris. And then you would hear that Gal 30 cannon. So they would vanish after they passed over, and you hear that broop, broop, broop. And then they would pull up out of the haze, and they would kick out the countermeasures flares, and then they would go around and they'd come around again. It was magnificent seeing how the A-10s just tore the shit out of anything that moved in front of us. And then whatever's left, we shot up, and it was like that going into night. Dark. We're wearing PVS-7 night vision goggles, so everything is just green and black. And maybe you lift those off your head, or you still have them on, back and forth. But you're watching, it's an inferno because there's vehicles burning to the front of us, to the sides of us, and we're hitting them. And we're hitting vehicles that have been hit. We're hitting vehicles that haven't been hit. I bet your average Iraqi tank probably got hit 3-4 times by our tanks and our Bradleys. And it's so as it goes into nighttime, and we have these chem lights on the antennas. So you see these little bobbing blue lights on the antennas, and then you just see spots of flame of burning Iraqi vehicles, like hundreds of them. It was really, really something. We stopped at one point, probably the next morning after I really remember that nighttime fires and vehicles burning. And the battalion kind of consolidated and did almost like a giant circling of the wagons with tanks. And a couple of fire support officers came together in our FIS Vs and pulled up next to each other. Paul Mapp, we called him Topo Mapp, who's now he's a professor at William and Mary of early colonial American history, but second lieutenant, Princeton graduate. He's in the vehicle next to me, and his GPS doesn't work, and my laser locator won't work. And this is, I don't know, 7 o'clock in the morning. My driver and I he's sitting just inside his hatch, and I'm standing on top of the vehicle, and I'm eating turkey dice with gravy, MRE. I got my Steiner binoculars in front of me. I guess I still have my Kevlar on. And I look at my binoculars, and off in the distance, there's a couple of T-72s just moving by themselves. And so my laser locator isn't working, but Paul Mapp, Topo Maps is. He doesn't have a grid. I give him the grid. He lasers the distance, gets the distance and direction. He sent the mission over to our howitzer battalion. And surreal as this is, I'm taking a spoonful of turkey dice with gravy, put the spoon back in the pack, lift the binoculars, and I'm watching. And I'm watching these T-72s move, and they're so far in the distance. And down drops the ICM. And we fucked them up. And it was just, I'm having my breakfast, and I'm watching them die in the distance. And it's, you can't see any individual Iraqi soldiers. It's too far away. But you can make out the tanks, and you can tell that they're T-72s. That was really interesting, very surreal to do that. Just eating while somebody's dying in front of me. And then, other things that come to mind is how effective we did our own resupply and refueling. That was beautiful. M1s have, with these turbo engines, they have very large air filters. They call them V-packs because they're shaped like Vs, these giant air filters. And there's an air compressor built onto the tank. And so you periodically have to stop, and then they use an air compressor to try to blow the sand and the dust out of these V-packs. So we do that while we refuel. And the logistics guys, the S4 of that tank battalion, really had this down. So they spaced the fuel tankers, the HEMTT fuel tankers, such that I think you could fuel 2 tanks at one time from one tank, or 2 hoses. So you'd line them up, and actually it might have been 4 even. So a full tank platoon would show up almost like in an H, and they would refuel 2 tanks simultaneously, while the 2 other tanks of that platoon were blowing out the V-pack air filters. And then as soon as those 2 tanks were done filtering, the hoses came over to these 2, and it was like a gas station. They just pulled up next to the vehicle, and then the next 2 blew out their V-packs. And while that's going on, then you pull forward to another set of trucks where they have resupply of the Sabo and heat rounds. And then they're very quickly passing the rounds up while the next is lined up. And then handing off packs of MREs for food. That was just minutes before they had us fully rearmed, refueled, new food, and we were back in the fight. It was really something. They were so good at that. At one point, I reached the point where I was so exhausted and I had a 4-man team. I had a private first class who was driving the track. Might have been a PB2. Scott Anderson, and then Spec 4 RTO, Darren Early, who I believe lives in New Orleans now as a medical technician, but we're not really in touch. I've never found Scott. And my senior NCO, he was a staff sergeant, Eddie Taylor, and then I'm up in the hatch. And at some point, Eddie T, Staff Sergeant Taylor, just realized I was so exhausted. He just taps me on the leg, and he just said, "Sir, you got to come down here and rest. I'll take over for you." And I laid down on these duffel bags on the floor of the track, and I slept so hard I drooled all over the place. I don't know how long I slept. I actually slept for a portion of a tank battle. because it was just a rolling battle as it was. And Eddie T, Staff Sergeant Taylor, took over for me in the hatch. I reached my limit. I'd been awake for 72 hours. I just couldn't do it anymore. And then at some point with all of this, I think I'm back up again. I'm back in the hatch, and we just got the call that stop. And so we stopped, and we stood in place for, I don't know, it might have been a day or two. And that's when we heard it was over. And our guys went to sleep, Darren Early and Scott Anderson, and we were at 50%. So Eddie T, Staff Sergeant Taylor, and I stayed up. And I remember I had a Sony, like a little boom box, like a sort of water resistant one. And I was playing a George Strait mixtape. And even Eddie T, who was not a country music fan, I just remember him saying, it was just so nice to listen to George Strait and just realize that it was done and that we were finished. And then that was it. Then we sat out in the desert for a while, and then they moved us over into Kuwait, because we ended up in Kuwait, but they sent us up near Safwan, and we did a relief in place. Now that ground operations were over, and we took over from the 1st Infantry Division, who were going to redeploy back to the States, and we then took over the border zone during the ceasefire period, and we were border security just inside Iraq, in and around the Safwan Red Cross camp, and we stayed out there for a couple of months. And at that point, we finally did that officer rotation. I went to a firing battery because combat operations were over. We had already put the right shoulder patch on our uniforms, and we stayed there on border duty on the Iraqi border for a couple of months. And then they pulled us back finally when the UN came in and took over. And while this was going on, then they had the oil mill fires, and we were very close to those. You would just get covered in soot from the air, just raging fires. And you get within, say, a quarter mile of one of these, and just the huge rushing sound and the heat coming off of it. But they pulled us back. We were getting ready. We were getting our vehicles ready to redeploy back to Germany. This would have been about, the first week of May. And then the Army decided to leave a combat brigade in Kuwait as the Army started to redeploy. And we were that brigade, so they sort of pulled the rug out from under us on redeploying, and we went down to Kuwait City, and we were the first garrison, what later became Camp Doha. And that stayed open until Camp Arifjan opened just less than 10 years ago. So we were the very first occupants, and we stayed until the 12th of June. It was my 25th birthday. And then by that time, the 11th Armored Cavalry had deployed from Germany post-combat operations. They became the garrison brigade for that future continuing mission. And we redeployed to Germany. We went down to the port, we reloaded our vehicles, and on the 15th of January, 179 days later, via a Tower Air 747, we landed back in Germany. It was done.
So, but your greatest memory were those 4 days, I suppose.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But it was all of it too. Huge boredom in Camp Doha. Huge boredom. Went through a lot of Scott Follett, Pillars of the Earth, W.E. Griffin novels. Became very good at hacky sack. Became a damn good, hearts and clubs player. A lot of card games. It was just huge boredom at that point. But again, good experience. There's a lot of memories in there. But yeah, and we were back in Germany on block leave. I railed around Europe for that month off, and had another year left in my tour in Germany. Did rotations to Grafenwehr and the other training areas as both a fire direction officer and a cannon platoon leader. Then I went back for the Field Artillery Advanced Course in the summer of '92. Got out of the Army in the summer of '93, and Was out as a guardsman and as a reservist until September of 1999 when I went back on active duty at White House Communications, which was also significant because I was on duty on 9/11.
Okay. Okay, so now we're in 1990. Well, let's see. I may have
1999.
1999. Okay, but when you left the artillery, you were a first lieutenant. What was your rank then?
First lieutenant, senior first lieutenant.
All right.
I got off active. Are we recording now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I got off active duty in July of 1993, and I went to work as a civil environmental engineer in St. Louis area. And I joined the Missouri National Guard, an artillery battalion. Was there for 2 years in both the Guard and working as an engineer there. And then I transferred to Baltimore and in the same engineering job, left the National Guard and went to the Army Reserve. And so I had that 6 years from leaving the regular Army until in 1999, I was called to active duty to go to the White House Communications Agency, WACA, which is a joint agency that handles all the communications for the president, both audio, visual, secure and unsecure voice, every aspect of the president's ability to communicate, including continuity of operations, everything that you can picture that would go with that as commander-in-chief. And so in 1999, I was mobilized specifically to help White House Communications, WACA, find reservists that they could call to active duty for short periods of time, say 6 months at a time, to fill positions that were vacant. Because White House Communications, as a joint agency, had Air Force, Navy, Army, and then about 900 people total among those three services, plus a couple of Marines. And to get to the White House Communications Agency, you'd have to go through a fairly high level of clearance and suitability background. So you can't just be cleared at a high level. You have to have an unusually clean record. Like if you had 5 speeding tickets in a year, they would just reject you. If you had ever committed infidelity in a marriage, they would just not take you, and you had to admit it. So they were very picky. And so from the time a service member was selected to come to the agency until they arrived, could take a year, sometimes longer. But that position would be vacant until they arrived. So I would look for reservists who could plug positions for short periods of time, because you could do that waiting for somebody to be fully cleared and brought in. And so that's what I did. I would recruit reservists who were available. I'd work out the details of getting them mobilized through their services, bring them in. They would pull their duty, and then they would go back home when the permanent person would come in. And once I got that structure set up, I started traveling because I was mobilized on active duty. I started traveling as a presidential communications officer. Was one of the most traveled in the agency. I was single at the time. All over the United States, a number of locations overseas, and the biggest one was I was what was called the hub officer, or the deputy communications officer, on 9/11 in Sarasota, Florida, when the attacks occurred. So I was not actually at the school. Our trip lead, Army Lieutenant Colonel Tom Herman, a signal officer, was there at the school. I was at the hotel hub where we had all the communications hub data and our switchboard operations, and we would coordinate the president's phone calls when whoever he needed to reach, we would coordinate that phone call to try to push through. And so when the attacks occurred, it was just a routine presidential visit. And we, of course, always kept a TV running, CNN at the time. And when the first plane hit, we were obviously stunned. When the second one hit, it became clear that something was going on. And that was the time when the president was told. And so we had to handle his phone calls to the director CIA, the director FBI. And we had a very difficult time doing that. because as a cost-cutting measure, just a few months before, we had quit traveling a full-blown switchboard and satellite communications capability on domestic trips that we used to do because it didn't seem like it was necessary. Well, what happened is 9/11, the entire eastern seaboard, both mobile phones and landline phones, got so saturated, we had extreme difficulty in getting the president's calls out because we relied on that infrastructure. Even an encrypted classified call would still go over those lines just using a particular type of device that would allow that. We had tremendous difficulty trying to get his phone calls out. But we handled that until he got on the plane with a number of our team members. I did not get on that plane with them. And then he left, and at that point we no longer had responsibility for him. But it was a very tense hour or so because we had to facilitate his ability to communicate, and it was so critical then, and we had a lot of obstacles. And after that happened, those cost-cutting measures were reversed, and we stopped doing that. And then we actually got stuck in Sarasota for a couple of days, and then they did get us out. They flew in an Air Force C-141. They picked our team up with all our equipment, and as we were landing back in Andrews Air Force Base, my mobile phone goes off, and our ops coordinator and our Waka headquarters called me and told me that and these teams are fairly large. You can have 40, 50 people and a lot of equipment. So we have a full plane and a lot of equipment loaded, tied down on the center of the aircraft in the cargo area. And he told me that just me and two others, and one of them I think was Air Force, and the other was a Navy first class petty officer. The three of us and a small set of equipment from that aircraft as we were landing, we're going to turn around and get on another C-141 immediately. And this was the 13th of September, I believe. And we flew into McGuire Air Force Base, got there at about 11 o'clock at night. So we never left the tarmac in Andrews except to get on another aircraft and leave. And it's what was called it down and dirty. We landed, we got about 2 or 3 hours of sleep while AT&T, I believe it was, sent one of their senior technical managers out, and we had to immediately put in all the phone lines and secure communications equipment there on the flight line and in the VIP terminal for the MAC terminal on the Air Force Base to prep for the president's 747 coming in, because that was going to be his first foray into Manhattan. And it was a really, really stressful night because there were only 3 of us, and we had to put all of this in just a matter of hours, including running phone lines out to the aircraft, because we would put landlines into Air Force One in a particular way that would allow them to continue communicating using, more reliable phone lines. And we did make it. We got it all set up, and I was changing from my jeans to a suit in the MAC terminal or the VIP terminal, and as I come out of the stall and I'm in front of the mirror adjusting my tie, there's a guy who's struggling to put a sweater on, and then he pulls it over, and sure enough, it's the mayor of New York, because they had brought him into McGuire so that he could greet the president and get on the president's helicopter. So I got to briefly talk to the mayor, and then so the president then comes in on a 747. We hook up all his communications, and then another error on my phone. He transfers from the 747 over to his VH-3, his helicopter, series of helicopters, because they have to take the press with them and the presidential staff and what have you. And then they flew into Manhattan. They did their thing, and then a couple hours later, they flew back in. We dealt with their communications again while they were at McGuire. And then he got on the smaller aircraft and he flew out to their ranch in Texas. So it was a very stressful, hectic 4 or 5 days between 9/11 and the end of the McGuire Air Force Base piece. And But that was overall, it was a wonderful tour. It was a very stressful duty. I ended up doing it for 3 years. And then while there, I learned about the State Department and left active duty to join diplomatic security service within the Foreign Service of the State Department, and did a career overseas, including civilian armed duty in Iraq during war, which, it was interesting because now I was getting shot at as a civilian. But here nor there, I know this is a veterans thing. So I ended up doing 25 years total of government service, 8 years active duty in the military over those 2 periods, and then another 17 years in the diplomatic security service. And I'm now retired after a whole bunch of tours overseas.
In terms of the working with the communications, so you were still in the Army at that point?
I was an Army reservist.
Okay.
And I was mobilized as an Army reservist, and I ended up spending 3 years on active duty.
And what was your role before you were field artillery? Now what is it?
Yep, I was, even though I was still branch field artillery, nominally my role was to find these reservists and put them into these positions. But I spent by far the majority of my time actually serving as a presidential communications officer. In what would normally, had I been regular Army, it would have been a signal officer's position. Wasn't an issue. They allowed me to travel anyway. I did all the signals and communications work, but that was fairly easy for me with my background in engineering. I just got the technical stuff, and it was more management and leadership than the technical aspects. I'm one of the very few reservists ever to have a presidential service badge on my uniform.
Nice. So 8 years of active duty, right?
Yep.
Then you said you worked with the State Department?
Yep. I was in the Foreign Service. I retired as a supervisory special agent in what is called the Diplomatic Security Service. It's the law enforcement and security arm of the State Department. And we have duties domestically. It was passport and visa fraud investigation, criminal investigations, dignitary protection, and then overseas, we're in charge of law enforcement interface in places where there's not an FBI legal attaché, and then we are responsible for the security and well-being of our facilities and our people in consulates and embassies. So my career I did after training, where I was a badged and credentialed law enforcement officer and a member of the Foreign Service. I went to the Secretary of State's protective detail. I spent a year on the permanent detail for Secretary of State Colin Powell all over the world with him. And then I went into a series of high threat training iterations, and then I went to Basra in southern Iraq for what was then called a regional embassy office, not a consulate. And I was there for a year working with the British Army. And actually I was under more fire as a civilian in Iraq in 2004, 2005 than I was in the Army in Desert Storm, because we were rocketed and mortared with some regularity. It was an extremely dangerous place. And then from there, I went to a year of Russian language school, and then I went to Uzbekistan for 3 years, and then from Uzbekistan, where I was assistant regional security officer, the number 2 in charge of our security at our embassy in Tashkent. And then I went to St. Petersburg, Russia, where I was the lead security officer for our consulate in St. Petersburg in northern Russia. Did that for 2 years. Then I was the resident agent in charge of our criminal investigations office in New Orleans. And then from there, I was the deputy regional security officer for our embassy in Kuwait for 2.5 years. And then from there, I went back for a refresher for 7 months to brush up on my Russian at the State Department's language school in the DC area. And then I went to Dushanbe, Tajikistan as the lead security officer for our embassy there. And then from there, the State Department sent me to the Sinai, where I was a civilian observer for treaty verification in the multinational force and observers there to implement the conditions or terms of the treaty between Egypt and Israel that came out of the Camp David Accords. That was a pretty neat tour also. Did that for 2 years, and then I'm fully retired.
A lot of traveling.
Yeah. 8 tours in the State Department, and 6 of them were overseas. 7 years in the former Soviet Union. And then if I added up all my time in the Middle East, from Desert Storm up to my time in Kuwait, I had and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. I figure I have several years in the Middle East, and I have about almost 12 years of service in predominantly Muslim countries. Fascinating career. Soviet Central Asia was an amazing place. I loved it.
And how did you get into security in the State Department, given your background of what you're doing before? Like, how did you make that transition?
Well, while I was at White House Communications, we would periodically, when we were overseas, and then also I supported in late 1999 the Shepherdstown peace talks, I kept encountering special agents of the Diplomatic Security Service. And I also realized that I was no longer career regular Army, and that this mobilization was going to end. And it was going to put me back where I had been, which was as a civil environmental engineer, which was a lot of field work, but it was a lot of, you're a project engineer. I was working in cubicles. I was working for privately held companies, stockholders. And I didn't enjoy it. It didn't have much meaning. My purpose in life was to make money for company owners or stockholders. And so while I was at White House Communications, I was dreading returning back to civilian life. It just didn't hold a lot of purpose for me. So about a year before I left White House Communications, almost on a lark, I put in an application for a job posting for the Diplomatic Security Service, went through the whole interview process, got put on the Order of Merit list or the register, and actually got picked up. So I interviewed and was put on the register right before 9/11. And then after 9/11, was almost immediately called to go. But by that time, I'd already committed to another year of active duty. So I ended up postponing my State Department employment for an additional year, that third year at White House Communications. And from there, I leveraged to get into the Diplomatic Security Service. I leveraged my experience with White House Communications, because they work very closely on overseas trips with the State Department, and often with diplomatic security. And my experience as both an engineer and as a soldier, and that was enough to make my case to make the cut. And Diplomatic Security Services, it's one of the most difficult competitive jobs you can get in the federal government. And I was lucky, and I ended up with an amazing career. Amazing.
Very interesting. Going back, and we're almost done. Going back to your experience in those, let's say the 4 days, all right, in Iraq. Have you heard the phrase "war is hell"?
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you agree with that, given what you've seen?
My experience is not that of one of General Sherman's line soldiers, and it was not the experience of my World War II predecessors in the 3rd Armored Division, say, and I've met many of them, with the guys who were in the 36th Armored Infantry Regiment and who served in the 32nd and 33rd Armor, where they were in the line for just week after week after week, and were going up against equipment that wasn't always better than what the enemy had. I mean, their equipment wasn't as good as what the enemy had often. And so that surely would have been hell for them. But my experiences were shorter durations, intense, but of shorter duration. So I'm not going to... Of course, war is hell, but for me, war is confusion. war is stress. It's confusion. It's questioning your own abilities at times. It's having to grapple with and come to terms with you're not aware of everything that goes on around you. The fog of war is more apt for me than war is hell, because you often feel helpless, because you don't know everything you need to know. So I won't say war is hell, because I didn't do what my great grandfather did in the First Wisconsin Cavalry, or another one in the 6th South Carolina Cavalry, where these guys signed up for the duration and they were in that's hell. But for me, it's fog, it's confusion, it's stress, it's lack of sleep, but not what those guys had.
And after those 4 days of that stress, that fog, you mentioned the word surreal. How did you feel after that combat and they told you to, okay, stop and take a break?
Relieved. Relieved. Now, not long after that, in hindsight, I kind of wish we had gone further and harder. And then, of course, that became very apparent to me 15 years later, because it sure caused us a lot of mischief later. But yeah, it was relief back then. I later, because of some of these events, especially the friendly fire event, that has weighed on my mind very heavily in the ensuing years. But there's nothing I could really. I mean, it happened, and I have to. It's nothing. I mean, I know I'm not responsible for it. I didn't shoot, but that and watching those Iraqis surrendering die, it weighs on me today, and it has for 30 years, and it will until I'm dead.
Well, that was kind of where I was going next, in terms of, did you bring anything home from your experience in those 4 days? And it seems like it has.
I have diagnosed PTSD. The VA has diagnosed that, but so many of us do. It's just, something that stays with you. It's not comfortable, but as years pass, you sort of come to terms with it. When I'm with people who are there with me, it's very easy to talk about it. It's difficult right now. 20 years ago, I couldn't have even said as much as I've had now. I don't know. It is what it is.
And what is it about those moments? Like, what if part of the project, part of the reason for the interview is to make other folks aware of this, because most people don't know this. And so I think this is really important, and I applaud you for being brave and courageous in sharing. And I think it's really important that people understand it. So you say that you've borne it, you don't talk about it, you are now, but what is the trigger, the response, the daily? Do you think about it daily? What happens?
I think about it daily. If I talk about it, it brings on a kind of an uncontrollable melancholy. It just chokes me up, but I can't stop it from happening. But at some point in my day, every day, these experiences come to mind. Often they're a source of strength or just a source of just memory. But at other times, they're a source of great sadness. Um, and it's hard to put your finger on it. It's just a just sort of a cloud of melancholy that comes over you. Um,
Is there anything that particularly triggers it?
well, memories, sounds, certain smells, rotting meat, the smell of diesel exhaust, but mostly memories. Yeah.
What triggers the memories?
Oh, talking about it. It's if I speak in generalities, it's um, it's not an issue, but sometimes in specifics, or when I begin to sort of get the feeling of being back, and it kind of comes on.
And what have you done to help yourself with that? Do you have any strategies or tips or
The most effective thing has definitely been just trying to get in touch and stay in touch with friends who are there with me. As an example, I do a little part-time work for the State Department as a retiree, and I was in New Jersey, just across the river from New York. Is our field off the diplomatic security field offices in Fort Washington, and I'm part of a team of retirees who work on an as-needed basis to interview special agent candidates. And I was very fortunate in that one of the guys who was a lieutenant with me, he lives in that area, and I hadn't seen him in 20 years, maybe 25 years, and we had dinner together, and that's very therapeutic. I was in Minneapolis on one of these interview trips in September, and another one of these guys I served with is in Minneapolis, and we got to spend an evening just drinking beer and having food and talking, and just staying close with these guys who were with me. And in some cases, one of my VMI classmates was in my battalion with me. He's a brigadier general in the Virginia National Guard now, and just staying in touch with people who shared those experiences is very helpful. It's most difficult in talking to, you're a stranger, and this is very difficult for me to do. It's easier when it's either somebody who was there with me or just had a very similar experience. But for the most part, I need to, and I don't know what your experience is, but trying to tell it to somebody I don't know, I usually just avoid the subject.
And why is that? Like, why the words are the same, the feelings are the same. Like, this is interesting to me, and the events are the same, right? Those are not changed. You're talking to me, the face is different, but that doesn't change how you feel or anything else. So do you have any ideas why it might be more hard to talk to a stranger about it?
I don't know. I don't know, because they're thoughts and emotions that I tell you right now, you just can't. For me, you just can't. You can't control it. You just sort of manage it.
Do you have the same type of reactions telling those stories to somebody that was there with you? Or is that different with them versus somebody like me?
When I'm with somebody I was there with, it's easier for me to sort of let it go. I tell you, well, shit, you don't want to, especially as a guy, you come up in the military, federal law enforcement, it's not really comfortable to find yourself basically crying in front of a stranger. You've spent your life since you were a little boy. You don't cry. You don't. And when you're with somebody, I don't know. It's just when it's with somebody who was there with me, maybe the guard isn't up.
But the emotions are still the same. They're easier to express with a colleague.
I guess so. I don't know that I've really been asked a question like this before. But yeah, and it was maybe harder in this case because we've spent an hour and a half, 2 hours going over these events in detail, and it's led to more recall and more thoughts. And a lot of the experiences out there were good. It's just, but other things, and some of this didn't really even begin to visit me until a year and a half, 2 years later. It was really, really bad in the 90s, terrible. I just really avoided talking about it because I have much better control over it, I'd say now. I mean, it still eats the shit out of me, but.
And did you have trouble sleeping?
Oh, I do, yeah.
And still to this day?
Yeah, I don't sleep well. I'm prone to nightmares, and oddly enough, they're often not about when I was out there, but I'm prone to nightmares, and just difficulty falling asleep. I listen to audiobooks every night to fall asleep. That's what it takes. If I put an audiobook, I'll be asleep in 2 or 3 minutes. If I don't play somebody telling me a story, I might lay awake for 15, 20, 30 minutes, an hour. So I sleep to an audiobook. And if I wake up in the middle of the night, which I do often, I start the audiobook again. I was listening to a history of sort of a combined history of the First and Second World War and the interwar period for the last several days. I could start the same chapter over again 15, 20 times, which is fine with me. Another favorite of mine is a BBC history of classical music. I've probably listened to it 40, 50 times. But yeah, I guess to some degree it just leads to a certain, I don't know, just long-term unsettling of the mind.
Do you go to veteran reunions?
I was one of the founding 5 guys who founded the Association of 3rd Armored Division Veterans about 22, 23 years ago. And there's a pretty good website, and they now hold large annual reunions. But originally it was 5 of us who founded it because there was a 3rd Armored Division Association of World War II veterans, and they actually would not open their ranks to us. And now they're gone. Almost none of them left, and we wanted them to include us and make it an all eras division association. And when they didn't, we created our own. It's an incorporated nonprofit. I stepped away from it while I was at White House Communications because the travel schedule was so heavy, and I'm still a life member, but I'm one of the founders.
Do you go anymore or plan on going?
I haven't gone to one of the reunions in over 20 years, but I've usually been overseas, and then of course this COVID stuff. I may go to the next one, and I think it's a year from now, and then I think there's some sort of mini reunion not tied specifically to that association, and it might be in San Antonio, and maybe in the spring. I've pondered that. And take Facebook. I dislike Facebook, and I tend to be pretty private on Facebook, but it has been a tremendous tool to get back in touch with people I served with who I never, ever would have found if not for Facebook. And there are many of us that are linked there. In fact, my battalion actually really had stars fall in it. Ray Odierno, who later was Chief of Staff of the Army and Commander of Forces in Iraq, he was my battalion XO when he was a major. I think out of the lieutenants and one captain, one major, and 4 or 5 lieutenants made general officer out of that battalion. Really significant.
Okay. Is there anything that I did not ask you that you would like to add?
Not that comes to mind now. There's plenty of stories. You have Camp Doha and having, Saudi company doing the food catering and basically giving us all food poisoning, and to see a whole brigade with dysentery, which is pretty bad, funny at the same time. If you don't run to the shitter, you're gonna shit yourself. But if you walk, if you do run, then you can't hold it together. And it was just really, really something, seeing hundreds of guys sick at the same time. And just little memories like that, or playing cards for hours, or the endless games of hacky sack because you're so bored at times. It's just all this stuff. That was a good experience.
Well, Brian, it's been a great pleasure speaking with you today. I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to do that. And I want to thank you for everything that you've done for your country. It's been an honor.